The wind didn't just blow across that ridge. It stripped everything bare. Fear, hope, even the last strength of a dying woman. And there, standing between life and death, was a boy with a broken rifle, ready to fight a man he didn't know. What could make a child choose to stand instead of run? And who was the silent cowboy willing to kneel instead of fight? Stay with me, because this story isn't about guns. It's about something far more powerful.
The wind through the Bitterroot Valley didn't howl, it scraped. It was the kind of autumn wind that stripped the dead leaves from the chokecherry bushes and left the branches looking like bleached bones. Silas Dunn had ridden through 3 solid days of it before he saw them. A boy, standing on a ridgeline. From 100 yards out, he looked no taller than a fence post. But he was holding his ground, and he was holding a rifle. Silas pulled back on the reins. His gelding stopped, blowing softly into the cold air. Silas narrowed his eyes against the grit. The rifle was useless, snapped clean in half at the breech. The boy held the wooden stock in his left hand, the heavy iron barrel in his right. He had them raised and pointed right at Silas's chest, as if sheer willpower could make the broken pieces fire. Behind the boy, half hidden in the tall yellow sagebrush, was a woman. She was crumpled on the ground. A dress the color of faded sky, stained dark at the collar. She wasn't moving. From 100 yards, Silas couldn't tell if she was breathing. From 50 yards, he still couldn't tell. Silas kept his hands in plain sight. He rested them on the saddle horn. He rode closer, slow, deliberate. He was a man who had learned the hard way that every sudden movement cost something, and he spent his gestures carefully. 30 yards. 20. The boy was 9. Maybe less. His pale green eyes were wide, terrified, and entirely feral. He was shaking so hard his boots vibrated against the dry earth, but his jaw was locked. He didn't lower the broken iron. He was standing between a strange rider and his dying mother, and he was fully prepared to die right there on the ridge. Silas stopped his horse. He looked at the boy. The boy looked at him. Silas didn't speak. He hadn't spoken a single word in 4 years. He had taken an oath to his own silence, wearing it like a heavy winter coat. But he knew how to read the silence of others. He saw the fight or flight tearing through this child's chest. Slowly, Silas swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the dirt. He raised both hands, open palms. Then, using only his left hand, Silas unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy leather, the Colt revolver. He let it drop to the dirt, a soft, heavy thud. The boy's eyes darted to the gun, then back to Silas's face. The shaking in his small arms got worse. Silas took 3 steps backward. He knelt in the dirt. Complete surrender. If you have to shoot someone, the posture said, shoot the man on his knees, not the man standing. Reaching into his saddlebag, Silas pulled out a small, scarred chalkboard and a piece of white chalk. The scratch of the chalk against the slate was the only sound on the ridge besides the wind. He wrote, big block letters. He turned the slate around, held it against his chest. I will not hurt you. I will not hurt her. I have water. The boy stared at the board. He looked at Silas. Then he looked back over his shoulder at the woman on the ground. A single tear cut a clean line down the boy's dust-covered cheek. The broken barrel in his right hand finally, slowly, lowered to the grass. Silas stood up. He left his gun in the dirt. He walked past the boy, moving softly, and knelt beside the woman. She was young, pale. Her ash-blonde hair was matted with dried blood from a bullet graze along her temple. It wasn't a fatal strike, but it was deep. She was in profound shock, dehydrated, fading fast. If she spent the night on this ridge, the frost would finish what the bullets started. Silas slid his arms under her. He lifted her. She was shockingly light. He carried her to his horse and settled her carefully across the saddle. He turned back to the boy. The child was still standing there. He had picked up the broken pieces of the rifle again. He was clutching them to his chest like a lifeline. Silas stepped close. He held out his hand, palm up, waiting. The boy hesitated. To give up the gun was to give up his final defense. But he looked at his mother on the horse. He looked at Silas's quiet, steady gray eyes. The boy placed the broken barrel in Silas's hand. Then the stock. Silas didn't toss the pieces into the brush. He didn't throw them away. Instead, he walked over to his saddlebags. With slow, deliberate care, he strapped the broken halves of the rifle to his bedroll, tying them down tight. He treated that ruined weapon like it was made of solid gold. The boy watched him do it. And in that moment, something shifted in the child's eyes. He understood. This stranger wasn't going to throw away the thing that made him brave. Silas tapped his own chest. He took the chalk. Silas. He offered the chalk to the boy. What is your name? The boy just shook his head. He pressed his lips together tightly. It wasn't that he didn't have a name. It was that he couldn't say it. Silas recognized the look immediately. Trauma. The kind that reaches in and steals your voice right out of your throat. Two mute souls, standing on a windy ridge in the Montana Territory. Silas didn't push. He just nodded. He lifted the boy up onto the horse, settling him securely behind the saddle, right behind his mother. The boy reached out and grabbed a tight fistful of Silas's canvas coat. Silas picked up his gun belt. He took the reins, and he started the long walk home. They made it to the ranch just as the sun bled out over the western horizon. Silas carried the woman inside and laid her on his own bed. It was the only room with a hearth. He had no doctor, no nurse. He had clean water, a bottle of rye whiskey to clean the wound, and the brutal triage skills he'd learned on the battlefields of his youth. He worked fast, washing the dried blood, pressing single drops of water past her cracked lips, piling thick wool blankets over her shivering shoulders. Through it all, the boy stood perfectly still in the doorway. He refused to sit. He refused to look away. Silas finished bandaging the woman's head. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, and brought back a heavy wooden chair. He set it down right next to the bed, right beside her pillow. He pointed to the chair. He looked at the boy. The child walked over and sat down. His legs dangled inches above the floorboards. Silas went to the saddlebags. He brought back the broken rifle. He placed the pieces gently on the boy's lap. Then Silas pulled up a stool on the other side of the fire. The night stretched out. The fire popped and hissed. Silas kept watch. The boy kept watch. Neither of them spoke a word. They didn't need to. Silas Dunn had kept his silence for 4 years. He had believed that silence was the only honest thing he had left to give the world. He had believed he was a ghost, just waiting for his body to catch up. But that night, sitting in the orange glow of the hearth, watching a 9-year-old boy guard his dying mother with a broken rifle and a stubbornness older than time, Silas realized a bitter truth. There were people out here willing to throw away everything they had to protect a single heartbeat. And there were men back east, sitting in leather chairs, who signed away dozens of lives without making a sound. Silas looked at the woman breathing softly under his blankets. He looked at the boy gripping the broken wood. Some people don't need your words. They just need you to stay. So, he stayed. Pain has no memory, but it has a language. When Hannah woke, the pain in her head was a blinding white sheet. It covered her eyes. It covered her mind. She didn't know the ceiling above her. Rough-hewn pine logs, pitch bleeding from the knots. She wasn't in St. Louis. She wasn't on the trail. Panic hit her like a physical blow. Her chest seized. She pushed herself up on her elbows. The room spun. Où suis-je? The words tore out of her throat. French, the language of her childhood convent, the language of sudden fear. A shadow moved near the fire. A man, tall, broad-shouldered. She scrambled backward against the headboard. The wool blanket pooled around her waist. ¿Dónde está mi hijo? Mi niño? Spanish now. The language she'd used in the dusty missions of Sonora, when the fever took her husband the first time. The language of desperate bargaining. The man didn't step closer. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't say a word to calm her. Instead, he reached for a small piece of slate resting on the bedside table. He picked up a stick of white chalk. He wrote. It took him only a few seconds. He stepped into the light of the oil lamp. He turned the slate toward her. You are safe. He is safe. Sleep. Hannah stared at the white dust on the black stone. Her breath hitched. She looked past the slate into the man's face. Gray eyes, weathered skin, deep lines carved around his mouth, the kind that came from squinting into the prairie sun. He was looking at her with a profound, terrifying stillness. He wasn't evaluating her. He wasn't pitying her. He was just waiting for her to understand. Caleb, she whispered, her native tongue finally returning. English, the language of her heartbreak. Where is my boy? The man turned. He pointed toward the foot of the bed. Hannah leaned over. There, curled on a thick buffalo robe by the hearth, was Caleb. He was sound asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady, even rhythm. His face was smudged with soot and dirt. But he was whole. He was alive. Hannah let out a sob. It cracked in the quiet room. She fell back against the pillows. Her hands covered her face. The man stepped away. He didn't linger. He didn't try to comfort her with clumsy hands. He simply walked to the kitchen area, poured a cup of water from a tin pitcher, and set it on the nightstand. Then he walked out the heavy front door, closing it softly behind him. He gave her the one thing she needed most, space to breathe. 3 days passed like that, a feverish blur of waking and sleeping. Hannah slowly pieced the world back together. She learned the man's name was Silas. She learned it from the slate. She learned that Caleb wouldn't leave Silas's side. The boy followed the tall cowboy like a shadow, to the woodpile, to the barn, to the well. And Caleb still wasn't speaking. He hadn't spoken since his father died coughing blood in a St. Louis boarding house 6 months ago. Hannah had hoped the open air of the Montana Territory would bring his voice back. The ambush on the trail had only buried it deeper. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Hannah sat up, her head pounded, but the white-hot sheet of pain was gone. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her bare feet touched the cold floorboards. She stood. Her knees wobbled. She grabbed the bedpost to steady herself. She looked around the room. It was painfully neat. A man's house, but stripped of the usual bachelor grime. The floors were swept. The iron stove was blacked. Then she looked at the stone mantelpiece above the hearth. She stopped breathing. There, resting across 2 iron pegs driven into the mortar, was Caleb's broken rifle. It wasn't tossed in a corner. It wasn't shoved into the kindling box. The 2 snapped pieces of wood and iron had been wiped clean of trail dust. The metal barrel had been oiled. It was displayed right in the center of the house. A place of absolute honor. Hannah walked toward it. Her fingers brushed the splintered wood. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and fast. She had traveled across 3 continents. She had sat in Parisian parlors and heard men recite poetry. She had stood in Mexican plazas and listened to men sing songs of eternal devotion. She knew how men used grand gestures to make themselves look big. But this silent cowboy hadn't fixed the rifle. He couldn't. It was ruined. But he had taken the ruined thing her son had used to defend her, and he had treated it like a holy relic. He was telling a 9-year-old boy, I see what you did. It mattered. The front door opened. Silas stepped inside. He was carrying an armful of split cedar. He saw Hannah standing by the mantel. He stopped. She turned to him. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. Why did you keep this? She asked. Her voice was scratchy, raw. Silas set the wood down by the stove. He pulled the chalk from his vest pocket. He took the slate from the table. He wrote. He didn't rush. He formed every letter with care. He handed the slate to her. It's the thing that made your boy brave. That matters. Hannah read the words. 13 words. She looked at Silas. He was already turning away, feeding a log into the belly of the stove. On the 5th day, she was strong enough to sit at the small oak table. Silas was sitting across from her. He was mending a leather bridle with a thick needle and waxed thread. Caleb was out in the barn, brushing down Silas's gelding. Hannah folded her hands on the table. She sat up straight. She was a missionary's daughter, a widow. She knew the brutal economics of the frontier. "Mr. Dunn?" she said. Silas looked up. He set the leather down. "I need to understand our situation," Hannah said. Her voice was steady now, clear. "I have no money. The men on the trail took my husband's lockbox. I have no horses. You told me they were killed. My brother-in-law's land is in Wyoming, 400 miles south, and I am in no condition to ride." Silas just watched her, listening. "I have been a burden on you for nearly a week," she continued. "You saved my life. You saved my son. I need to know what I owe you, and I need to know how you expect me to repay it." She braced herself. She knew how the world worked. A woman alone with a man in the middle of nowhere. There was always a price. Silas reached for his slate. He wiped it clean with the heel of his hand. He took the chalk. He wrote for a long time. He slid the slate across the oak table. Hannah looked down. "You don't owe me anything. When you are strong enough, I will take you to the railhead in Billings. You can telegraph your family in Wyoming. I will pay for your tickets. Until then, this is your home." Hannah read the words. She read them again. She looked up at Silas. Her green eyes narrowed slightly. "No man gives that much to strangers, Mr. Dunn. What do you want?" Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He pulled the slate back. He wiped it clean. The sound of his palm against the stone was loud in the quiet kitchen. He took the chalk. He pressed hard. The letters were thick, white, defiant. He pushed it back to her. "I want to not watch another woman die on the cold ground. That's all I want. That's all I've wanted for 4 years." Hannah stared at the board. 4 years. She looked at the man sitting across from her. She looked at his scarred hands, his quiet, heavy eyes. She had spent her entire life translating languages, unraveling the hidden meanings behind verbs and tenses. But sitting in this small cabin, with the autumn wind rattling the window panes, Hannah Whitmore met a language she had never encountered before. The language of a man who had entirely stopped trusting his own voice. She realized with a sudden, quiet ache in her chest that she was going to have to learn it. The house smelled different. For 4 years, Silas Dunn's cabin had smelled of wood smoke, black coffee, gun oil, wet wool. It was the scent of a man living entirely inside his own head. Now, there was the sharp, clean scent of lye soap, the soft smell of rising yeast dough from the bowl covered with a towel near the stove, the scent of lavender pressed into the folds of a woman's dress. It had been 3 weeks. Silas stood on the porch, tightening the cinch on the wagon harness. Caleb was beside him, handing him the leather straps. The boy still hadn't said a word, but he anticipated Silas's movements like a seasoned ranch hand. Hannah stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a borrowed coat of Silas's. The sleeves rolled up past her wrists. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight. The bruise on her temple had faded to a pale yellow. "We ready?" she asked. Silas nodded. He offered his hand. She took it, stepping up onto the wagon bench. Her hand was warm, calloused from days of helping him scrub the floors and mend fences. He let go the moment she was seated. Town day. It was a 10-mile ride into Bitterroot, a muddy strip of civilization cut into the pines. A saloon, a livery, a telegraph office, and Everett Crane's General Mercantile. Silas usually made the trip alone. He liked it that way. Get in, buy flour, coffee, nails, get out. But Hannah needed out of the cabin, and she needed fabric, needles, things Silas didn't know how to buy. They rolled into town just past noon. The street was deep with October mud. Silas pulled the wagon up to the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. He set the brake. Inside, the store smelled of peppermint sticks, oiled leather, and chewing tobacco. Everett Crane was standing behind the heavy oak counter. He was a man who wore too much pomade in his hair and smiled with only the bottom half of his face. He looked up as the bell above the door jingled. He saw Silas. He smiled. Then he saw Hannah step in behind him, followed by the boy. Crane's smile changed. It got thinner, oily. "Well now, Mr. Dunn," Crane said, wiping his hands on a dirty apron. "I heard the rumors from the freight drivers. Seems you've acquired yourself a family out there." Silas stiffened. He reached into his coat for his slate. Before his fingers even touched the chalk, Hannah stepped past him. She walked right up to the counter. She placed her hands flat on the polished wood. She looked Everett Crane dead in the eye. "I am a guest in Mr. Dunn's home," Hannah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was cold. Absolute zero. "My husband is dead. My son and I were ambushed on the Bitterroot Trail. Our wagon was taken. Mr. Dunn saved our lives and offered us shelter while I recover." Crane blinked. He took a half-step back. "Now, ma'am, I didn't mean any—" "I don't care what you meant, Mr. Crane," Hannah interrupted. The tone belonged to a woman who had negotiated with port authorities in Shanghai. "If you or the fine people of this town have questions about my character, you will ask me to my face. And you will mind your manners when you do. Are we understood?" The store was dead quiet. Crane swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am, understood." "Good. Now I need 5 yards of heavy cotton muslin, 2 spools of black thread, and a sack of your finest milled flour, not the bottom barrel sweepings." Silas stood by the door. His hand was still inside his coat, resting on his slate. He looked at Hannah's back. Her spine was straight as a plumb line. For 4 years, Silas had believed that words only caused destruction. He had believed a voice was just a tool to lie, to manipulate, to break things. But watching Hannah tear Everett Crane down to the floorboards to protect her son and the dignity of the man who saved her, Silas felt something crack open in his chest. She used her voice like a shield. They loaded the wagon in silence. Silas paid Crane. They drove out of town just as the sun started to dip below the tree line, painting the sky bruised purple. 2 miles out of town, the road narrowed where it cut through a dense stand of lodgepole pines. A figure was standing in the middle of the road. Silas pulled back on the reins. The horses stopped, tossing their heads. It was Nakota Joseph. The old man wore a heavy wool blanket over his shoulders. His face was a map of deep creases, brown as cured tobacco. He stood perfectly still, looking at the wagon. He didn't look at Silas. He looked straight at Hannah. "You brought a woman into the house, Silas Dunn," the old man said. His voice was like grinding stones. Silas gripped the reins tighter. He felt his throat go dry. "Does she know?" Joseph asked. Hannah looked at Silas, frowning. "Know what?" Silas shook his head. He looked down at his boots. Joseph took 1 step closer to the wagon. He kept his eyes on Hannah. "He brought you to a house that stands over graves. Did you know that, woman?" Hannah's breath hitched. She looked at Silas again, demanding an answer. Silas couldn't look at her. "She will find out," Joseph said quietly. He finally looked at Silas. The pity in the old man's eyes was worse than anger. "The land speaks, Silas. It always speaks, no matter how much dirt you throw on top of it. The question is whether she hears it from you, or if she hears it from the earth itself." Joseph turned. He stepped off the road and melted into the shadows of the pines. The ride back to the cabin was suffocating. Hannah didn't ask questions. She didn't demand answers. She sat rigid on the bench, staring straight ahead. That was worse. The silence between them wasn't comfortable anymore. It was loaded. That night, after Caleb was asleep by the fire, Silas sat at the kitchen table. Hannah was across from him. She had a book in her lap, but she hadn't turned a page in an hour. The only light was the kerosene lamp swinging slightly above them. "Silas," she said softly. "The old man today. Nakota Joseph. What did he mean?" Silas closed his eyes. This was it. The moment she would leave, the moment he would be completely alone again. He reached for his slate. He held the chalk. He stared at the blank black stone. "I can't write this," he thought. "It's too long. It's too heavy." His vow of silence wasn't a choice anymore. It was a prison. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tear the words out of his throat and lay them on the table. He opened his mouth. He tried to push air past his vocal cords. Nothing came out, just a dry, broken wheeze. The muscles in his neck strained. He slammed his fist down on the table in frustration. The coffee cups rattled. Hannah flinched, but she didn't look away. Silas stood up. He walked to the heavy iron lockbox sitting on the floor by his bed. He took a small brass key from his pocket. He unlocked it. He reached past his savings, past his land deed. He pulled out a thick leather-bound journal. The edges were worn soft. He walked back to the table. He set it down in front of Hannah. He picked up his slate. He wrote fast. His hand was shaking. "Read it from the beginning. If you stay after that, I'll know who you are." Hannah looked at the slate. Then she looked at the journal. She reached out and rested her hand on the leather cover. She looked up at Silas. He didn't wait. He turned, walked to the front door, and stepped out into the freezing October night. He sat down on the edge of the porch. He pulled his collar up against the wind. He stared out at the dark pasture. Inside that journal were the names. 37 names. The ages. The children. The last words of the Nakota people who had frozen to death, because Silas Dunn had used his smooth, convincing voice to translate the lies of a corrupt land commissioner named Marcus Reeves. Silas had written them all down because it was the only grave he could give them. And now, the woman he had saved was turning those pages. He didn't know if she would still be there when the sun came up. He wouldn't blame her if she packed her bags and took the boy and started walking south. But as he sat there in the biting cold, listening to the faint rustle of paper coming from inside the cabin, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. He was finally known. And whatever happened next, that at least was a relief. The fire burned down to orange teeth. Hannah didn't add more wood. She didn't notice the cold creeping over the floorboards. She just kept turning the pages. The leather journal smelled of old dust and sweat. The paper was heavy, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting. It wasn't the frantic scrawl of a madman. It was perfect, meticulous, the script of a man desperate to keep things in order when the world had torn itself apart. She read it all. 1876. Silas was 33, a translator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, working under a man named Colonel Marcus Reeves. Reeves wanted the Bitterroot grazing land. He wanted it for a private cattle syndicate he held shares in. But the Nakota people lived there, had lived there for generations. So Reeves lied. He told the Nakota that the government had better land for them down south. Water, game, shelter. And he made Silas translate the lie. Silas hadn't known. That was the tragedy of it. He believed Reeves. He believed in the promise. And Silas was good at his job. He spoke their language with respect, with warmth. He looked the elders in the eye and promised them safety. Because he believed it, they trusted him, they packed their camps, they moved. The new land was a graveyard. Alkaline dirt. No water. And the winter came a month early. Hannah traced her finger over the ink on the next page. Her breath shuddered. They weren't just numbers. Silas had written them out like a ledger of his own damned soul. Little bird, 7 years old. Died coughing. Runs with deer, 62. Froze in the first storm. Winter crow, mother of 3, starved. 37 names, 11 of them children. Under each name, Silas had written the last thing they were holding when they died. A carved wooden toy, a blanket, a handful of dry dirt. Hannah reached the final page. The ink here was pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through. "I did not pull a trigger," Silas had written. "I pulled a tongue. And 37 people are dead because I was good at speaking. So I will not be good at speaking anymore. Not ever again. That is my oath. And if God has any mercy left for men like me, he will let me keep it until I die." Hannah closed the book. Outside, the wind had stopped. The sky through the window was turning the pale, bruised gray of early dawn. She stood up. Her joints ached. She walked to the window. Silas was out there, sitting on the chopping block near the woodpile. Frost clung to the shoulders of his canvas coat. He hadn't moved all night. He was just staring at the tree line, waiting for her to walk out the door, pack her bags, and leave. Hannah pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. She opened the heavy oak door. The freezing morning air hit her face like a wet towel. She walked down the porch steps. The frozen grass crunched beneath her boots. Silas didn't turn around. His shoulders were rigid, braced for the blow. Hannah stopped right behind him. She laid the leather journal on the flat top of the chopping block right beside his knee. "Silas," she said. He slowly raised his head. He looked at her. His gray eyes were bloodshot, hollowed out. "You were lied to," Hannah said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the still dawn air. "You were lied to by a man you trusted. You did not kill those people." Silas shook his head. He reached into his coat. He pulled out the small slate. He wrote, his hand numb from the cold. "A weapon that lets itself be used is still responsible." Hannah looked at the chalk. Then she looked at the man. "Yes," she said, "it is. But a weapon that spends 4 years rusting in the dark, grieving instead of acting, is not responsible, Silas. It's just lost." She stepped closer. She didn't touch him. She just stood in his line of sight. "My father was a preacher," she said. "He used to tell me that the soul of a good man is not measured by the wrongs he has done. It's measured by what he does the morning after he realizes he was wrong. You have been punishing yourself for 4 years, burying yourself alive out here. That isn't justice. That's just more silence. And the Nakota dead do not need your silence." Silas stared at her. He didn't write. The crunch of boots on frost broke the quiet. They both turned. Caleb was standing on the porch. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt, shivering in the cold. He looked at Hannah. He looked at Silas. The boy walked down the steps. He walked right up to Silas. He reached out. His small, pale hand grabbed the thick fabric of Silas's sleeve. He tugged it. Silas knelt in the frost. He put himself at the boy's eye level. Caleb opened his mouth. His jaw worked. His throat swallowed hard. He hadn't used his vocal cords in 6 months. "Stay," the boy whispered. It was raspy, like dry leaves dragging across stone, but it was loud enough. "Please," Caleb croaked. "Stay. With Mama. With me. Don't go away." Silas froze. The breath hitched in his chest. He looked at the boy. This child, who had lost his father, who had lost his voice, who was now looking at Silas Dunn like he was the only solid thing left on the whole spinning earth. Silas closed his eyes. He nodded. Once. Twice. He didn't write it. He just pulled the boy in by the shoulders and held him tight against his coat. Hannah stood above them, the tears finally spilling hot down her freezing cheeks. 3 days later, the sky opened up. It wasn't a snowstorm. It was a late autumn deluge, freezing violent rain that turned the bitterroot soil to thick black soup. It rained for 3 days straight, pounding against the tin roof of the barn, turning the creek into a roaring beast. On the 4th afternoon, the clouds broke. Silas walked out to check the pasture fence line. Hannah watched him from the kitchen window. An hour later, he came walking back, fast. He didn't come to the house. He went straight to the barn. He came out carrying a heavy iron spade. He headed around the back of the barn toward the sloping hill that led down to the creek. Hannah felt a cold knot pull tight in her stomach. She threw on her coat. She told Caleb to stay by the fire. She ran out into the mud. By the time she reached the back of the barn, Silas was digging. The heavy rain had caused a mudslide. A massive chunk of the hillside had sheared away, washing down into the creek. But it hadn't just revealed rocks. It had revealed a wall. It was a root cellar, or something like it, built into the side of the hill, mortared stone, and a heavy iron door, rusted shut. Silas was slamming the spade against the iron latch. His face was pale. The veins in his neck were standing out like cords. He swung the spade again and again. The metal clanged, ringing out across the valley. The rusted padlock shattered. Silas dropped the spade. He grabbed the iron handle. He threw his whole weight backward. The door groaned. It shrieked against its hinges, and it pulled open. The smell hit them first, not rot, bone dust, dry, chalky, and ancient. Hannah stepped up beside him. She looked inside the dark, cavernous space. Bones. Hundreds of them. Rib cages the size of barrels, skulls with heavy horns, cattle. A mountain of slaughtered cattle. And resting on top of the bone pile were shovels, pickaxes, lanterns. Silas stepped into the dark. He picked up one of the lanterns. He brought it out into the daylight. He wiped the mud from the brass base with his thumb. There, stamped deep into the metal, were 3 letters, BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs. And beneath that, etched into the brass by hand, was a name. Property of Monsieur Reeves. Hannah stopped breathing. It all clicked into place. The missing cattle. The reason Reeves wanted the land. He hadn't just stolen the Nakota's grazing rights. He had slaughtered their herds to starve them out, forcing them to take the deal and move south. And he had buried the evidence right here. Hannah looked at the dirt under her boots. "He sold you this land," she whispered. Silas stared at the lantern. His hands were shaking. "When you left his service," Hannah said, the horror dawning on her, "when you bought this ranch, you bought it from him. He sold you this exact parcel of land on purpose." It was the ultimate cruel joke. Reeves had turned Silas into an unwitting accomplice. He had buried his sins, and then he had sold the graveyard to the very man who felt guilty about it. Reeves knew Silas would hide away here. He knew Silas would never dig. He knew the guilt would keep the cowboy quiet forever. Hannah looked at Silas. "We use this," she said fiercely. "We use it against him." Silas shook his head, violently. He dropped the lantern. He reached for his slate, hands trembling so badly he dropped the chalk. He picked it out of the mud. "He is land commissioner now. He controls the railroad. He can destroy us." Hannah grabbed his arm. Her grip was tight, bruising. "Silas, look at me." He looked. "He already destroyed 37 people," she said, pointing toward the house, toward the journal. "He destroyed you. For 4 years he took your life. Are we going to let him destroy us too? Are we going to let him win because you're afraid?" Silas looked at the open vault. He looked at the bones. He looked at the BIA stamp. Then he looked at Hannah, her fierce green eyes, her chin tilted up against the wind. He slowly lowered the slate. He let it drop into the mud. He closed his eyes. He swallowed. His throat worked. He pulled air deep into his lungs. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He opened his eyes. And for the first time in 4 years, Silas Dunn spoke. It wasn't a whisper like the boys. It was a harsh, rusted grating, the sound of an iron door being forced open after half a decade in the dark. "No," Hannah stared at him. "No, we won't let him?" Silas nodded. He didn't pick up the slate. He didn't need it. He looked at the mass grave. Then he looked at the horizon, toward the town, toward Helena, toward Reeves. The silence was over. Winter in the Montana Territory doesn't just arrive, it drops like a hammer. By mid-November, the snow was piled up to the windowsills. The wind shrieked through the lodgepole pines, a constant high-pitched wail that made the timbers of the cabin groan. They were snowbound. 6 weeks isolated from the world. No trips to town, no mail, no escape. Just Silas, Hannah, and Caleb trapped in a single room with a wood stove and an iron bed. It was a claustrophobia that would have driven most people mad. But for the three of them, it was an incubator. The rhythm of the days became a slow, deliberate dance of survival in proximity. One evening, deep into December, the wind was particularly brutal. Caleb was asleep on his buffalo robe, completely worn out from helping Silas stack firewood in the mudroom. Hannah was sitting by the stove, darning a hole in one of Caleb's wool socks. Silas was sitting across from her, carefully oiling a saddle girth. "My husband was a good man before the sickness took him," Hannah said. She didn't look up from her needle. It was the first time she had spoken about Thomas voluntarily. Silas paused his work. He set the oily rag down. He listened. He was an architect, brilliant, always looking up at buildings, never down at the street. She smiled, a sad, thin thing. "When the consumption started in his lungs, we moved to Mexico. The dry air was supposed to help. It did for a while." She tied off a thread. She bit the end of it, snapping it clean. "But pain changes a man, Silas. It eats the grace right out of you. The last 2 years, he was bitter. He hated his own body, and he started hating me because my body worked. He yelled, he threw things. The man who died in that boarding house in St. Louis wasn't the man I married." Silas picked up his slate from the table. He still used it for long thoughts, resting his voice. "I am sorry." "Don't be," Hannah said. She looked up at him. "I learned something. Women are taught that love is the poetry men recite when the sun is shining. It isn't. Love is what a man gives you when he has absolutely nothing left." She gestured toward the dying fire. "Thomas had nothing left, and he gave me his bitterness. But he also gave me Caleb, so I cannot say he gave me nothing." Silas stared at the fire for a long time. The orange light danced across his scarred knuckles. He took his chalk. "What have I given you?" Hannah set the sock in her lap. She looked at this large, quiet man. "You gave my son a place safe enough to use his voice again," she said softly. "You gave me a bed to sleep in where I wasn't afraid to close my eyes. You gave me a place where I didn't have to translate my heart to be understood." She leaned forward. "Silas, you have given us everything." Silas didn't write back. He just held her gaze until the fire popped, breaking the spell. The winter became a season of teaching, of hands. Silas taught Hannah how to braid leather rope. It wasn't something he could explain with a slate. It required touch. He stood behind her at the kitchen table. He reached around her, his large, rough hands guiding hers over the stiff rawhide strips. Over, under, pull tight. His chest was inches from her back. She could feel the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing. When his calloused fingers brushed the back of her wrist, he didn't pull away like he used to. He lingered, just for a heartbeat. In return, Hannah taught him French. She would sit beside him on the edge of the hearth. She opened a worn copy of Victor Hugo. She pointed to a word. Silas would read it, his voice still rough, scraping the rust off his vocal cords. When he stumbled on a pronunciation, Hannah would reach out. Her soft, ink-stained fingers would gently tap the page, right next to his thumb. Touch. Correction. Patience. And in the middle of January, during a brief, week-long thaw, they wrote the letter. They cleared the kitchen table. Hannah brought out her good paper, a bottle of black ink, and a steel-nib pen. Silas brought out his leather journal. They were going to bypass Helena entirely. Marcus Reeves owned the territorial politicians. They were sending this straight to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., and copying it to a journalist Hannah knew in St. Paul. "We need every detail," Hannah said, dipping the pen. "No emotion, just facts. Men in suits only respect ledgers." Silas nodded. He sat beside her. He opened the journal. He didn't use the slate. He used his voice. 1876, Silas rasped. October 14th. The first treaty was signed. Hannah wrote. Her handwriting was elegant, sharp, and totally merciless. For 3 hours, Silas spoke. He detailed the lies. He detailed the grazing rights. He detailed the mass grave hidden under the hill behind their house. And then he read the names. Little Bird, Runs with Deer, Winter Crow. Hannah wrote every single one of them down. As she wrote the ages of the dead children, her hand trembled. But she didn't stop. Caleb sat on the floor near their feet, quietly drawing a picture of a horse with a piece of charcoal. He knew important work was happening. When the letter was finished, it was 6 pages long. A dense, undeniable indictment of Colonel Marcus Reeves. Hannah slid the final page over to Silas. She handed him the pen. Silas looked at the bottom of the paper. There was a space for his signature. He took the pen. But he didn't just sign his name. He wrote a final paragraph. His hand was steady. My name is Silas Dunn. I was the voice that led these people to their deaths. I will now be the voice that tells the truth, even if it costs me everything I have left. He signed it. Bold, black ink. He set the pen down. It won't cost you everything, Hannah said quietly. Silas looked at her. I'll be here, she said. From the floor, Caleb looked up from his drawing. And me, the boy chirped, his voice much stronger now. I'm staying too. Silas looked from the boy to the woman. It was late. The wind had picked up again outside, howling against the eaves. The fire was dying down to embers. Caleb curled up on his buffalo robe and fell asleep almost instantly. Hannah slid down from her chair. She sat on the braided rug in front of the hearth. She pulled her knees up to her chest. Silas moved from the table. He sat down on the rug beside her. Not too close, but not far. They watched the embers glow. In Paris, Hannah whispered, staring at the fire, men write poetry to women and leave it under their plates. In Mexico, they stand under balconies with guitars. I have been loved in 4 different languages, Silas. She turned her head to look at him. None of them meant what this means. Silas didn't write. He didn't speak. He simply reached out his hand, slow, deliberate. He laid his large, scarred palm over her hand, where it rested on her knee. Hannah didn't pull away. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. His grip tightened. Warm, solid, real. They sat like that until the fire went completely dark. Hannah Whitmore had spent a lifetime listening to men who thought love was a performance, a grand speech, a promise of the world. But here, in a snowbound cabin in the Montana Territory, she was finally being loved in the only language that actually mattered, the language of staying. The language of showing up every single day to haul the water, chop the wood, and hold the hand of the person sitting beside you in the dark. It was a language that didn't need translation, because her bones had always known it, and she had simply been waiting for a man brave enough to speak it. Spring in the Montana Territory doesn't arrive with gentle breezes and blooming flowers. It arrives with violence. The ice on the Bitterroot River broke in mid-April. It sounded like cannon fire echoing off the canyon walls. The snowmelt came rushing down from the high country, turning the creeks into muddy, roaring torrents. The frozen earth softened, turning the roads into knee-deep bogs of thick black clay. The thaw meant life was returning. It also meant the roads were open. Silas rode into town on the first day the trail was passable. He rode his heavy gelding, leaving the wagon behind. Tucked inside his canvas coat, wrapped securely in oilcloth, was the heavy envelope, 6 pages, 37 names. Everett Crane was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile when Silas rode up. The mud was splashed halfway up Silas's boots. Silas stepped up onto the wood planks. He walked straight past Crane and into the post office alcove at the back of the store. He placed the heavy oilcloth-wrapped envelope on the brass scale. Crane walked in behind him. He leaned the broom against the counter. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at the addresses written in Hannah's elegant, sharp hand. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Washington, D.C., the St. Paul Pioneer Press, St. Paul, Minnesota. Crane's eyes flicked up to Silas. The oily half-smile was completely gone. "Mr. Dunn," Crane said, his voice dropping an octave. "These addresses. You're stirring up a hornet's nest." Silas didn't reach for his slate. He just stared at the storekeeper. Cold. Unblinking. "There are men in this territory," Crane said, leaning closer. "Powerful men. Men who won't be pleased to see paper like this moving east. Accidents happen on these muddy roads, Silas. To men, to women, to boys." Silas reached across the counter. He moved so fast, Crane didn't even have time to blink. Silas's large, calloused hand wrapped in the loose fabric of Crane's shirt collar. He pulled the storekeeper forward until Crane's chest slammed against the brass scale. Silas leaned in. His face was inches from Crane's. He opened his mouth. "Send it." The voice was a rusted, guttural rasp. It was only the second time Silas had spoken in 4 years. The sound of it made Crane go entirely pale. Silas let go. He tossed 2 silver coins onto the counter. He turned and walked out the door. He knew what would happen next. Crane would send the letters. Federal mail was sacred, even to a rat. But Crane would also send a telegraph to Helena. He would warn Marcus Reeves. The fuse was lit. Before heading back to the ranch, Silas rode north, up into the foothills. He found Nakota Joseph sitting outside a canvas tent, carving a piece of cottonwood with a bone-handled knife. Silas dismounted. He pulled a duplicate copy of the letter from his saddlebag. He handed it to the old man. Joseph took the papers. He couldn't read English well, but he recognized the format. A sworn affidavit. He recognized the column of names. The old man looked up at Silas. "For 4 years," Joseph said, his voice like dry leaves blowing across rock. "I have watched you live on top of the graves you helped dig, Silas Dunn. I watched you punish yourself with silence, as if keeping your mouth shut could undo what your words had done." Joseph ran his thumb over the ink. "I waited," the old man continued, "not because I forgave you. Forgiveness belongs to the dead. I waited because I knew you were not yet finished becoming the man you needed to be." Joseph stood up. He walked into his tent. He came back with a piece of charcoal. At the bottom of the last page, right beneath Silas's signature, Nakota Joseph drew his mark, a circle with a line through it, the setting sun. "Reeves will come," Joseph said, handing the paper back. "He is too clever to come himself. He will send wolves. Be ready." The wolves arrived exactly 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday. The mud had finally dried to hardpan. Hannah was hanging laundry on a rope strung between the porch and a nearby pine. Caleb was in the dirt, playing with a carved wooden horse. Silas was in the corral, shoeing the gelding. He heard them before he saw them, the rhythmic thud of hooves. 3 riders. Silas dropped the horse's hoof. He stepped out of the corral. He didn't run, but he moved with sudden, fluid purpose. He walked to the porch, grabbed his Winchester rifle from the rocking chair, and stood at the top of the steps. Hannah stopped pinning the laundry. She pulled Caleb behind her skirts. The 3 men rode into the yard. They didn't dismount. That was the first rule of frontier hostility. A man who stays in the saddle is a man looking down on you. They weren't lawmen. They wore canvas dusters and had the flat, dead eyes of men who killed for a day wage. Pinkertons gone bad or just outright thugs hired out of a Helena saloon. The leader spit a stream of black tobacco juice into the dirt. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his saddle horn. "Mr. Dunn," the leader said. He had a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. "We're here on behalf of a concerned citizen. He's heard you've been doing a lot of writing lately. He'd like it to stop." Silas stood perfectly still. The Winchester hung loose in his right hand, pointed at the dirt, but ready. With his left hand, Silas reached into his vest. He pulled out the small slate and chalk. He rested the slate on the porch rail. He wrote quickly. He held it up. "It won't stop." The leader laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Think carefully, cowboy. You got a nice little setup here." The man's eyes drifted to Hannah, to Caleb. He let his gaze linger just long enough to make it a violation. "It's a dangerous territory, wild animals, fires in the night. Be a real tragedy if that pretty blonde woman got hurt. Or the boy." Silas felt a cold, absolute rage settle into his bones. He didn't yell. He didn't raise the rifle. He wiped the slate clean. He wrote, pressing so hard the chalk snapped in half. He held up the board. "Tell Marcus Reeves I have spent 4 years believing I was already dead. I am not afraid to die. But if he sends men to my home again, he better send better ones, because you 3 won't make it off this porch." The leader read the words. His hand drifted toward the revolver on his hip. Silas didn't blink. He just waited. His thumb rested lightly on the hammer of the Winchester. The hired gun looked at Silas's eyes. He saw exactly what Caleb had seen on the ridge all those months ago. Complete, unyielding surrender to the violence required. The leader swallowed. He pulled his hand away from his gun. He tipped his hat. "We'll pass along your message," the man said. He wheeled his horse around. The other 2 followed. They rode out of the yard, kicking up a trail of dust. Silas lowered the slate. His hand was shaking, not from fear, from the pure adrenaline of restraint. He turned around. Hannah was standing right behind him. Her hands were gripping Caleb's shoulders tightly. She was pale, but her chin was up. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Silas sat at the kitchen table. He was cleaning the Winchester, over and over, oiling the action until it was slick. Hannah sat across from him. Silas put the oily rag down. He reached for the slate. "We can leave." Hannah looked at the words. Silas kept writing. "We can pack the wagon, go to Wyoming, to your family. I have enough saved. We can start over. Reeves won't follow if we leave the land." Hannah looked at him. She looked at the heavy iron lockbox sitting by his bed. She looked at the broken rifle still resting in a place of honor on the mantelpiece. "Do you want to leave?" she asked softly. Silas looked at his scarred hands. Then he looked up at her. He shook his head. "No," Hannah said. Her voice was firm. "I don't want to leave either. I want this fight." She reached across the table. She placed her hand over his. "I want those 37 names printed in the newspaper, Silas. I want Marcus Reeves to hear them read out loud in a federal courtroom. I want my son to grow up on land where the truth was spoken, not buried." She took a shaky breath. "But I am afraid." Silas turned his hand over. He interlaced his fingers with hers. He squeezed gently. With his free hand, he took the chalk. He wrote awkwardly, one-handed on the table. "Fear is not the opposite of courage." He wiped it, wrote again. "Fear is the soil courage grows in." Hannah read the words. A tear slipped down her cheek. She let out a short, watery laugh. "Who taught you to string words together like that, Silas Dunn?" she whispered. Silas gave her a small, crooked smile. He wrote one last line. 4 years of having nothing to do but think. By late June, the Bitterroot Valley had turned into an oven. The spring rains had been a lie. The sky baked to a pale, cloudless blue. The prairie grass turned brittle and yellow. The creeks shrank to muddy trickles, and then eventually to nothing at all. Drought. It was the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer like oil. The kind of heat that dried out a man's temper and cracked the earth wide open. In the second week of July, Silas dropped the wooden bucket down the well shaft. He waited for the heavy splash. It didn't come. Just a dull, hollow thud as the bucket hit dry mud. Silas hauled it back up, empty. The well had gone completely dry. First time in 5 years. Survival on a ranch without water is measured in hours, not days. They had a small reserve in the rain barrels, but it wouldn't last a week. They had to dig. For 3 days, Silas lived in the bottom of that dark, suffocating hole. He was 30 feet down, swinging a short-handled pickaxe in the dim light. The air was thick, tasting of dust and old earth. Above him, Hannah stood at the edge of the shaft, working the heavy iron windlass. Every time Silas filled the bucket with dirt and rocks, he would tug the rope. Hannah would crank the heavy handle, muscles straining, pulling the heavy load up into the blinding sunlight. Caleb would drag the bucket away and dump it. 32 feet. 35 feet. Silas swung the pick. The iron tip struck something hard. It didn't sound like rock. It was a hollow, metallic clang. Silas froze. He wiped the sweat and grit from his eyes. He dropped to his knees. He started digging with his bare hands, tearing away the packed clay. It was a box. Heavy gauge iron. Riveted seams. It was buried deep into the side wall of the shaft, wedged between two massive boulders. It hadn't fallen down here. It had been placed here deliberately, before the well was ever finished. Silas tied the rope around the thick iron handle of the box. He gave the rope 2 sharp tugs. "Pull!" he yelled up the shaft, his voice cracking from the dust. It took both Hannah and Caleb leaning their entire body weight against the windlass crank to haul it up. Silas climbed the wooden rungs driven into the dirt wall right behind it. When he pulled himself over the lip of the well, he collapsed onto the parched grass, chest heaving. Hannah was already kneeling beside the box. She used the edge of her apron to wipe the mud from the lid. It was locked with a heavy brass padlock. Silas didn't bother looking for a key. He went to the barn, grabbed a heavy sledgehammer, and brought it down on the brass lock. Once, twice, the lock shattered. Silas threw the lid back. The box was lined with oilcloth to keep the moisture out. Inside, resting in perfect preservation, were stacks of paper, thick legal parchment tied with red ribbon. Hannah reached in. Her hands were trembling. She untied the ribbon. She unfolded the top document. She began to read. As her eyes scanned the elegant cursive script, the color drained completely from her face. "Silas," she whispered. He knelt beside her. "These are the original grazing contracts from 1876, Hannah said, her voice shaking. "The land deeds. The transfer orders for the Nakota relocation." She flipped to the next page. "And here is the syndicate agreement. The ownership shares." She pointed to the signatures at the bottom of the page. Silas leaned in. "Marcus Reeves, State Senator William H. Clark, Federal Judge Thomas Vance." Twist. Marcus Reeves hadn't just buried the bones of the slaughtered cattle. He had buried the paper trail. He had kept the original fraudulent documents as an insurance policy. If his powerful partners in the Senate or the courts ever tried to cut him out or hang him out to dry, Reeves had the proof to drag them all down with him. He had buried it here on this isolated patch of land, and then sold the land to a man he thought was entirely broken. A man who would never speak. Reeves had made a miscalculation, a fatal one. "This isn't just a local crime anymore," Hannah said, looking up at Silas. Her green eyes were wide, blazing with sudden realization. "This is a federal conspiracy, Silas. This box is enough to hang half the territorial government." 2 days later, a black buggy with red spoked wheels rolled up the long dirt drive to the ranch. It was pulled by a matched pair of thoroughbreds that cost more than Silas's entire spread. Hannah was on the porch, snapping green beans into a tin bowl. Silas was leaning against the porch rail, whittling a piece of pine. The buggy stopped. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, a silver pocket watch chain draped across his vest. He wore a crisp white Stetson. Colonel Marcus Reeves. He didn't bring hired guns this time. He didn't need to. He brought his smile. "Mr. Dunn," Reeves said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. He walked toward the porch. "It has been a long time, 4 years, I believe." Silas didn't move. He didn't reach for his slate. He just stared at the man who had destroyed his life. Reeves stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at Hannah. He tipped his hat. "And you must be Mrs. Whitmore," Reeves said smoothly. "I heard of your tragedy on the trail. My deepest condolences. The frontier is a harsh place for a woman without a protector. Hannah didn't stop snapping beans. Snap, drop. It seems to be a harsh place for anyone who trusts a man in a suit, Colonel. Reeves's smile tightened just a fraction. He reached back into the buggy. He pulled out a heavy leather valise. He set it down on the bottom step of the porch. He unbuckled the straps. He opened the bag. Inside, stacked in neat banded bundles, was cash. United States tender. $10,000, Reeves said casually. More money than a man could make in 3 lifetimes working this dirt. He looked directly at Silas. I understand you've been having some trouble with the local element, Reeves said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. And I understand you've been digging a new well. Digging can be dangerous work, Silas. Sometimes you hit things you shouldn't. Reeves gestured to the open bag. Take it. Take the widow, take the boy, go to California, buy a fruit orchard, sit in the sun. If you leave this territory tomorrow and forget whatever it is you think you found, this is yours, and I will never speak your name again. Silas looked at the money. $10,000. It was a fortune. It was freedom. He didn't move. He looked at Hannah. Hannah set the tin bowl of beans on the small table beside her chair. She stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the edge of the porch. She looked down at Marcus Reeves. Colonel Reeves, she said. Her voice rang out clear and sharp across the hot, dry yard. I have been poor, Colonel. I have been widowed. I have been shot on a dirt trail and left for dead. I have been every kind of vulnerable a woman can be in this country. She pointed a finger at the valise. But I have never been for sale, not for $40 on a wagon train, and not for $10,000 on a front porch. Reeves stared at her. His smile completely vanished. My husband's name was Thomas Whitmore, Hannah continued, her voice building in strength, echoing the righteousness of her preacher father. My son's name is Caleb. This man beside me is Silas Dunn. And the names of the 37 Nakota you starved to death, Little Bird, Runs with Deer, Winter Crow, and 34 others, are names we are going to read in a federal courtroom in St. Paul. She took one step down the stairs. We have your iron box, Marcus. We have the signatures of your senators. There is nothing left of your reputation but the sound of those names. Hannah leveled her gaze right into his eyes. Take your money. Take your smile. Take your 15 years of silence and corruption. And take them off our land, now. Reeves stood frozen. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the wind rustling the dry grass. He looked at Silas. Silas just stared back, his hand resting lightly on the butt of the Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. Slowly, Reeves reached down. He closed the valise. He buckled the straps. He looked back up at Hannah. His eyes were cold, dead black. You are making a terrible mistake, Mrs. Whitmore, Reeves whispered. No, Colonel, Hannah said instantly. You made the mistake 4 years ago and every single day since. Reeves turned around. He climbed into his buggy. He whipped the horses, spinning the wheels in the dirt as he drove away. Silas stood on the porch, watching the dust trail fade. He turned to Hannah. He looked at her with an expression he had never worn before. It was a mixture of absolute awe, profound respect, and something much deeper than both. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out his slate. He wrote 3 words. He didn't show them to the world. He just held the slate up so only she could see it. I love you. He didn't say it, not yet, but he wrote it. And for Silas Dunn, writing it was a vow. Hannah looked at the white chalk on the black slate. The fierce, terrifying negotiator vanished. The missionary's daughter vanished. She was just Hannah again. She stepped across the porch. She wrapped her arms around his waist and buried her face against his chest. I know, she whispered into his coat. I have known since the night you wrote I will not hurt you on that ridge. You don't hear a prairie fire. You smell it first. It was the 3rd of July, 2 in the morning. The air was dead still, suffocating beneath a moonless sky. There had been no lightning, no dry storms rolling over the Bitterroot peaks. Silas woke in the dark. His eyes snapped open, his chest tightened. Smoke, bitter, heavy, smelling of burning sage and scorched earth. He threw off the woolen blanket. His bare feet hit the floorboards. He didn't bother with his boots. He ran to the window facing west. The horizon wasn't black. It was glowing. A jagged, angry line of orange teeth chewing through the dry prairie grass, driven by a sudden, unnatural wind blowing dead toward the house. Someone had set the grass. Silas turned. "Hannah!" It was a raspy, broken shout, but it was enough. She sat up instantly. The instinct of a woman who had lived on the edge of disaster. She didn't ask questions. She smelled the air. "Get Caleb," Silas ordered. His voice was scraping hard against his throat. "Wet the blankets." He pulled on his boots. He strapped on his gun belt. He ran out the front door into the suffocating heat. The fire was moving impossibly fast. A wall of flame 30 feet high, eating the drought-starved grass. It was less than a mile out. The roar of it sounded like a freight train rushing through the dark. Silas ran to the corral. He threw open the heavy wooden gates. He grabbed a coiled whip from the fence post and cracked it hard into the dirt. "Yeah, get out!" The horses panicked, bolting east, away from the smoke. He ran to the barn, opening the stalls, driving the milk cow and the few remaining cattle out into the open pasture. Run, just run. Sparks were raining down now, hot, glowing embers falling like orange snow. One landed on the dry, shake-shingle roof of the barn. It caught instantly. Silas sprinted back to the house. The heat was blistering. It singed the hair on his arms. Hannah was on the porch. She had Caleb wrapped in a soaked woolen blanket. The boy was coughing, his eyes wide with terror, but he wasn't crying. "The creek!" Silas pointed toward the rocky ravine to the east, the only place the fire couldn't cross. "Go!" Hannah grabbed Caleb's hand. She started running. Silas turned back to the open door of the cabin. The roof of the house was already catching. Smoke was pouring through the ceiling planks. He didn't run to the kitchen for the saved coins. He didn't grab the extra clothes or the winter coats. He ran to the bedroom. He hauled the heavy iron strongbox out from beneath the bed. The BIA papers. The proof. He hoisted it onto his right shoulder. He ran back to the living room. He grabbed his worn leather journal from the table, the 37 names. He shoved it inside his canvas coat. The smoke was thick now, blinding. The heat was a physical weight pressing against his lungs. He turned toward the door. And then he stopped. Through the stinging smoke, he looked at the stone mantelpiece, the broken rifle. Silas didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees to get under the smoke. He crawled to the hearth. He reached up, his hand searching blindly over the hot stone. His fingers brushed the splintered wood. He grabbed the 2 broken halves. He clutched them to his chest alongside the strongbox. He stumbled out the front door just as the main beam of the ceiling gave way behind him, collapsing into a shower of sparks and flame. He ran. He found Hannah and Caleb huddled in the muddy shallows of the creek bed. Silas slid down the embankment. He dropped the heavy iron box. He dropped the broken rifle. He threw his coat over them, shielding them from the falling ash. They sat in the dark, cold water. They watched their world burn. By 5 in the morning, the fire had moved on, leaving nothing but a blackened, smoking scar across the earth. The house was gone. The barn was gone. All that remained was the tall stone chimney of the hearth, standing like a lonely gravestone in a field of gray ash. Silas stood up. His face was streaked with soot. His hands were blistered. He looked at the ruin. He had built that cabin with his own 2 hands. He had cut those logs. He had mortared that stone. It was gone. But at his feet, safe in the mud, was the iron box, the journal, and the broken gun. Hannah stood beside him. She held Caleb tightly against her side. She didn't cry. She just looked at the smoking foundation. The sun crested the eastern ridge, casting long gray shadows over the burned land. And out of those shadows, figures appeared. Silas tensed. He reached for his Colt. But they weren't riders in dusters. They were walking, leading pack horses. It was Nakota Joseph. Behind him were 20 Nakota men, women, and children. They were carrying heavy canvas bundles, tools, sacks of flour, blankets. They walked directly into the smoldering yard. They didn't offer long, flowery condolences. They didn't stand around shaking their heads in pity. They simply set down their packs and went to work. A Nakota woman, her face lined with age, walked up to Hannah. She unclasped a heavy woven wool blanket from her own shoulders. She draped it over Hannah and Caleb. Then, without a word, she wrapped her arms around Hannah and held her. Hannah finally broke. She buried her face in the woman's shoulder and wept. A young Nakota boy, no older than Caleb, walked up. He held out his small brown hand. Caleb looked at it. Then Caleb reached out from under the blanket and took it. Nakota Joseph walked over to Silas. The old man stopped beside the iron strongbox. He looked at the smoking stone chimney. "For 150 years," Joseph said, his voice carrying over the hiss of the dying embers, "our people have been burned, Silas Dunn. We have been burned by fevers that came on white ships. We have been burned by fires set in the dark. We have been burned by papers signed in cities we have never seen." Joseph turned his dark, ancient eyes to Silas. "You have tasted one night of what we have tasted for generations. Now you understand." Silas nodded slowly. The soot on his face cracked. "We will help you rebuild," Joseph said. "I do not do this because I have forgiven you. I do not have the power to forgive the dead. I do this because the living must live, and the living must stand against the men who burn houses." By mid-afternoon, the air had cleared. The Nakota had pitched 3 large canvas tents for shelter. That was when the rider arrived. He was a stranger. Dressed in a dark suit covered in trail dust, he rode a tired chestnut mare into the yard. He stopped, taking in the devastation, the blackened earth, the Nakota people working in the ash, the white family standing among them. The man dismounted. He walked toward Silas. "Mr. Dunn?" the man asked. He looked at the devastation. "I'm Thomas Ashcroft, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Inspector General's office." Ashcroft took off his hat. "I received your letter in May. I came from Washington as fast as the trains and horses would allow. It appears I should have come much sooner." Silas didn't reach for his slate. It was gone anyway, burned to ash. He stepped forward. He looked Ashcroft in the eye. "You came at the exact right time," Silas said. His voice was rough, like dragging a stone across a steel grate. "Now you can see exactly who he is." They walked to one of the canvas tents. Hannah brought the iron box. Silas opened it. He handed the stacks of parchment to the federal inspector. Ashcroft sat on a wooden crate. He began to read. At first, his expression was purely professional. But as he turned the pages, as he saw the signatures, the blood drained from his face. He read the syndicate agreement twice. He looked up, his eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Dunn," Ashcroft breathed, This is more than enough. This will hang Marcus Reeves. But do you understand what else you have here?" Ashcroft pointed a trembling finger at the bottom of the page. "Reeves didn't act alone. He couldn't have. These names: Senator Clark, Judge Vance. These are sitting federal officials. This isn't just a corrupt land grab in Montana. This is a national syndicate. A conspiracy that reaches all the way to the Capitol." Ashcroft stood up. He began pacing the small tent. "I need to get this to Washington," Ashcroft muttered, thinking fast. "Under heavy federal escort. And I will need you, Mr. Dunn, and you, Mrs. Whitmore, to come to St. Paul. You have to give sworn testimony in a federal court." He stopped pacing. He looked at Silas. "But first," Ashcroft said, his voice dropping low, "I need to arrest Colonel Marcus Reeves before he finds out I'm in the territory, before he knows we have this box." Silas looked at the papers. He looked at the iron box. He stood up. He stood tall. His shoulders squared. And for the second time in 4 years, Silas Dunn spoke a full sentence. His voice wasn't just a rasp anymore. It had weight. It had the heavy, undeniable gravity of a man who has finally found his footing on the earth. "I'll ride with you to arrest him." Ashcroft blinked. "Mr. Dunn, that isn't necessary. You're a civilian. I can wire the U.S. Marshals." "It is necessary," Silas interrupted. He stepped closer to the inspector. "I am the one who let him use my voice to kill those people. I need to be the one who takes his voice away. It's the only way the oath gets kept." Ashcroft looked at the sheer, unbending will in the cowboy's eyes. He nodded slowly. "All right. We leave within the hour." Silas turned. Hannah was standing at the entrance to the tent. She didn't tell him to stay. She didn't beg him to be careful. She walked up to him. She placed her soot-stained hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm beating beneath his canvas coat. She didn't say a word. She just nodded. Silas touched her hand. He stepped out into the dying light of the burned prairie, and he went to saddle his horse. The arrest was almost too quiet. It happened on a Tuesday morning in Helena. Marcus Reeves was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk in his land commission office. He was drinking coffee from a porcelain cup, likely reviewing the property deeds of the men he had burned out. The heavy oak doors swung open. Inspector Ashcroft walked in, flanked by 3 U.S. Marshals carrying lever-action rifles. And behind them, blocking the doorway, stood Silas Dunn. Reeves stopped with the porcelain cup halfway to his mouth. For the first time in 15 years, the smug, practiced smile completely vanished from his face. "Colonel Marcus Reeves," Ashcroft said, pulling a folded paper from his breast pocket. "By order of the federal government, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and 37 counts of accessory to murder." Reeves carefully set the cup down. He didn't panic. He was a man who believed he owned the board, the pieces, and the players. "You're a very stupid man, Ashcroft," Reeves said smoothly. He stood up, adjusting his silk tie. "Do you honestly believe I will ever see the inside of a prison cell? I have friends, very powerful friends. They will have your badge before the sun goes down." Silas stepped fully into the room. His boots were loud on the polished hardwood floor. He looked at Reeves. "Your friends are being arrested in Washington as we speak, Colonel," Silas said. Reeves flinched. The sound of Silas's voice hit him harder than a physical blow. He had believed the cowboy was broken, mute, neutered by guilt. "You don't have any friends left," Silas said softly. The marshals moved in. They pulled Reeves's arms behind his back. The cold click of the iron handcuffs echoed off the plaster walls. The journey to St. Paul took 3 weeks. They traveled by train from Billings. It was Caleb's first time on a locomotive. The boy sat by the window, his face pressed against the glass, watching the planes roll by at impossible speeds. For the first time in months, Hannah saw the light of pure, childlike wonder return to her son's eyes. She sat across from Silas. He was quiet during the trip, but Hannah knew him well enough now to read the texture of his silence. This wasn't the silence of guilt. This wasn't the silence of a man hiding in the dark. This was the quiet, deliberate focus of a man gathering his breath, a man preparing to speak. The federal courthouse in St. Paul was a massive structure of white granite and marble. It felt like a temple. The gallery was packed. Word had leaked. The journalist Hannah had written to had published a preliminary piece. The whole city wanted to see the men who had stolen millions, and the cowboy who had brought them down. Reeves sat at the defense table. Next to him were 2 high-priced lawyers from Chicago. Hannah sat in the front row of the gallery, her hand resting on Caleb's shoulder. Nakoda Joseph sat beside her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. The federal prosecutor called his primary witness. "The government calls Silas Dunn." Silas stood up. He walked down the center aisle. He wore a borrowed suit that fit too tight across his broad shoulders, but he walked with the steady, measured stride of a man walking his own fence line. He stepped up into the witness box. He placed his left hand on the heavy leather Bible. He raised his right hand. He swore to tell the truth. He sat down. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man with wire-rimmed glasses, approached the stand. "Mr. Dunn, please state your name for the record." Silas leaned forward. He looked out over the crowded room. He looked at Reeves. "My name is Silas Dunn." His voice filled the courtroom. It was rough, carrying the gravel of a man who hadn't used it for a long time. But it was completely steady. For the next 2 hours, Silas spoke. He didn't use a slate. He didn't stutter. He laid out the entire brutal history. He told them how he was hired, how Reeves used the promise of water to manipulate the Nakota, how the syndicate moved their cattle onto the stolen land. He explained the root cellar, the BIA lanterns, the iron box in the dry well. The defense lawyers tried to object. They tried to rattle him. They tried to paint him as a disgruntled, unstable employee. Silas didn't break. He just waited for them to finish yelling, and then he kept speaking the truth. And finally, the prosecutor asked the last question. "Mr. Dunn, can you tell this court the human cost of Colonel Reeves's actions?" Silas reached inside his coat. He pulled out the worn, leather-bound journal. "Objection!" the defense attorney shouted. "That journal is not entered into evidence." "The witness is permitted to refresh his memory," the judge ruled, slamming his gavel. "Proceed, Mr. Dunn." Silas didn't need to refresh his memory. He knew the names by heart, but he opened the book anyway, out of respect. He looked at the page. Then he looked at the jury. 37 people died, Silas said. His voice was devastatingly quiet, forcing the entire room to lean in to hear him. And then he read the names. Little Bird, 7 years old. Runs with Deer, 62. Winter Crow, 28. He read every single one, slowly, giving each syllable the weight it deserved. When he read the names of the children, women in the gallery began to weep. He finished the last name. He closed the book. "I was the voice that sent them into the snow," Silas said, his eyes locking dead onto Marcus Reeves. Colonel Reeves was the hand that pushed them. The courtroom was completely silent, the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute conviction. Then, in the second row of the gallery, a man stood up. He was the journalist from the Pioneer Press. He began to clap. Slow, steady applause. The man next to him stood up. Then a woman. Then the whole row. Within seconds, the entire gallery was on its feet. The sound of applause thundered off the marble walls. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but it was useless. Marcus Reeves stared at the polished mahogany table. For the first time in his life, he lowered his head. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict took the jury less than 2 hours. Colonel Marcus Reeves was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He would die there 7 years later of pneumonia. The 2 senators were ousted from office and indicted separately. Judge Vance was stripped of his robes in disgrace. The land in the Bitterroot Valley was officially deeded back to Silas Dunn, free and clear. The original grazing lands were tied up in federal bureaucracy, but the process of returning them to the Nakota people had finally, officially begun. The newspapers called Silas the silent cowboy who spoke for the dead. They wanted interviews. They wanted photographs. Silas refused them all. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to go home. On their last night in St. Paul, Hannah stepped out onto the iron balcony of their hotel room. The city lights flickered below, reflecting off the dark waters of the Mississippi River. Silas was already out there, leaning against the railing. He looked exhausted. Testifying for weeks had stripped his vocal cords raw. Hannah stood beside him. She bumped her shoulder gently against his. "What happens now, Silas?" she asked quietly. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out a brand-new, small slate he had bought at a dry goods store in town. He took a piece of chalk. Hannah smiled. It was like seeing an old friend. "We go home. We rebuild the cabin. We plant an apple orchard where the ash is. We raise the boy. We live." Hannah read the words. Her heart swelled until it ached against her ribs. She looked up at him. her green eyes shining in the gaslight. "And us?" she asked. Silas stopped. He looked at her face, the blonde hair blowing across her cheek, the fierce, beautiful strength in her jaw. He put the chalk to the slate. He wrote very slowly. "I have one more word to say to you, Hannah, but I'm saving it for the right day." He handed her the slate. Hannah read it. A slow, brilliant smile broke across her face. She reached up, resting her hand against his rough cheek. "I've crossed 3 continents, Silas Dunn," she whispered. "I think I know how to wait." September came back around. 1882. A full year since the wind howled over that rocky ridge. The ranch didn't look the way it used to. It looked better. The new cabin was bigger, cedar logs notched tight against the winter wind. A wide covered porch facing the western horizon. Hannah had a small library corner. Caleb had his own room. It hadn't been built by one man. Nakota Joseph and his people had helped raise the walls. 3 new settler families from the valley had come to help frame the roof. Word about Silas had spread. People wanted to live near a man who wouldn't bend. Out back behind the house, the muddy hill was gone. In its place was a low stone wall. A memorial. Carved into the heavy river rock were 37 names. Nakota Joseph came every Sunday. He would sit by the wall for an hour, smoke his pipe, and walk back to the foothills. The past wasn't buried anymore. It was honored. And out in the western pasture, where the grass had burned to black ash, there were trees. Apple saplings. Dozens of them. Hannah had planted them in the spring. People said the soil was ruined. But Hannah knew something about ruined things. The ash made the dirt rich. By late summer, the first bright green leaves were pushing toward the sun. Caleb was 10 now. He was taller, broader in the shoulders. The hollow, haunted look in his green eyes was entirely gone. In fact, he talked so much now that Hannah sometimes had to gently tell him to quiet down. Sometime during the spring, Caleb had started calling Silas Pa. He didn't ask permission. Silas didn't make a grand speech about it. The boy just said it one morning at the breakfast table. "Pass the butter, Pa." Silas had simply nodded, handed him the butter, and that was that. He answered to it. Like he had been the boy's father from the very beginning. But the broken rifle was still there. It rested on the new stone mantelpiece, exactly where it belonged. Caleb never tried to play with it. But sometimes, before bed, he would stand and look at it. Silas had walked up behind him one evening. He put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't ever forget that gun," Silas had told him. "That broken piece of iron is the reason we're a family. You keep it forever." It was a Tuesday afternoon. The light was turning gold. Hannah was out in the young orchard. She carried a tin bucket, watering the saplings. Caleb was out by the barn, laughing, tossing a stick for a scruffy shepherd dog Nakota Joseph had brought over a week ago. Silas walked out of the barn. He wasn't carrying a pitchfork, he wasn't carrying a bridle, and he didn't have his slate. He walked out into the orchard. He stopped right beside Hannah. She smiled, wiping a stray lock of blonde hair from her forehead. "Hot out today?" Silas didn't nod. He didn't smile back. He just looked at her. Then he went down on one knee. Right there in the damp, ash-rich dirt, Hannah froze. The tin bucket slipped from her fingers. Water spilled over the toes of her boots. Silas reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a ring. It wasn't gold. It was simple, hammered silver. He looked up at her. His gray eyes were entirely clear. And then, for the 3rd time in his life, Silas Dunn used his voice to change the world. It wasn't a rasp anymore. It wasn't broken. It was the deep, resonant voice of a man who had finally come all the way home. "Hannah," Silas said. He took a slow breath. "Stay. Stay as my wife. Stay on the papers as Caleb's mother, the same way you've been his mother every day for a year. Stay on this land where we buried the truth and planted these trees. Stay until my hair goes white. until your hair goes white, until these apple trees are older than both of us." He held the ring out. His hand was perfectly steady. "Please, say yes." Hannah didn't reach for the ring. She dropped to her knees in the dirt right in front of him. She wanted to be exactly at his eye level. Tears were spilling down her cheeks, hot and fast. "Silas Dunn," she whispered. Her voice shook. "I have crossed 3 continents. I have spoken 4 languages. I have been valued at $40 on a wagon trail and $10,000 on a front porch. And I turned them both down. Do you know why?" Silas shook his head. "Why?" "Because I was waiting," she sobbed, a brilliant smile breaking through the tears. "I was waiting for the man who would ask me to stay. Not because he bought me, not because he pitied me, but because he couldn't imagine a single morning of his life without me." She reached out. She took his rough, scarred face in both her hands. "Yes, yes, I will stay. I will marry you. Yes, to everything." Silas slid the silver ring onto her finger. Hannah looked down. Stamped into the inside of the silver band were 2 words: Latin, the language of permanence. Quia manes, because you stayed. She threw her arms around his neck. Silas buried his face in her shoulder, wrapping his heavy arms around her waist, holding her like she was the only anchor holding him to the earth. Across the yard, Caleb dropped his stick. "Ma!" the boy yelled at the top of his lungs. "Pa, are you getting married?" Hannah laughed through her tears. "Yes, my love. Yes." Caleb spun around. Nakota Joseph was riding his pony down the ridge. Caleb ran toward him, waving his arms frantically. "Mr. Joseph, they're getting married!" The old man pulled up his pony. He looked down at the boy. A slow, deep smile cracked the leather of his face. "I know, boy," Joseph rumbled. "I've known since the day he brought her home." They were married 2 weeks later, right there under the young apple trees. It was a small affair. Ingrid Carlson baked a massive 3-tiered cake. Nakota Joseph performed the blessing because the bride and groom wouldn't have it any other way. Caleb was the ring bearer, marching down the grassy aisle with absolute, deadly serious pride. When it came time for the vows, Silas spoke them loud and clear. He promised to protect, he promised to cherish. His voice was a heavy, beautiful thing. That night, the house was quiet. Caleb was asleep on the sofa, a slice of cake still sitting on a plate near his head. Silas and Hannah sat out on the wide front porch. The sky was a canopy of crushed diamonds. Hannah sat sideways on the wooden swing, her legs draped over Silas's lap. Her head rested against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah asked softly. Silas kept his arm tight around her waist. He looked out toward the dark horizon. "I'm thinking about a ridge I rode up a year ago," Silas said. "I went out looking for lost cattle. I found a boy with a broken gun instead. Every good thing I have in this world, this house, this family, my own voice, it all started the second I stepped off my horse." Hannah traced the silver ring on her finger. "Do you believe in fate, Silas?" Silas thought about that for a long time. The wind rustled the pine needles above the roof. "No," Silas finally said. "I believe some things just find us, because we're finally ready to be found." Hannah smiled in the dark. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. The apple trees Hannah planted in the spring of 1882 grew taller than any trees in the Bitterroot Valley. Some folks in town said it was the soil, cleared by fire, made rich by the ash. Some said it was the water, drawn from a well that had finally given up its wicked secrets. Some said it was the care. The way Hannah sang to the branches in 4 different languages. The way Silas walked among them at dusk, carrying a silence that was no longer sad, but entirely at peace. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe it was none of them. Maybe some things simply grow where they are loved. Silas Dunn lived another 34 years. He never stopped speaking again, But he never became a man of many words. He said what needed saying. He stayed quiet when silence was the better gift. At his funeral, Nakota Joseph's grandson stood up and said, "He was a man who learned the weight of every sound and carried each one carefully to its right place." Hannah outlived him by 11 years. She taught Caleb's children how to speak French and Spanish. She taught them how to read a person's eyes before they read their lips. She never left the ranch. Whenever anyone asked her why she didn't travel anymore, she would just smile. "Because I finally found a place where I didn't have to translate myself to be loved." Caleb Whitmore Dunn grew into a man who never forgot the windy ridge where he stood his ground. He went east to school. He became a lawyer. He spent his entire career in courtrooms, defending people who had been lied to and broken by powerful men in suits. He kept the broken rifle on his own mantelpiece until the day he died. And then his son kept it. And then his son. That broken piece of wood and iron is still in a house in Montana today. Children sometimes visit. Their parents point to the mantel and tell them the story. A story about a silent cowboy who found a boy on a ridge and chose to stop and chose to stay. And really, that is the whole story. That is every story that has ever mattered. Someone was suffering, someone stopped, someone stayed. The rest is just details. And the apple trees, they are still there. Older than anyone alive in the valley. Still bearing fruit, still dropping sweet, heavy apples into the soil where the worst things burned, and the best things were finally, beautifully allowed to grow.
As the smoke clears and the echoes of gunfire, silence, and sacrifice fade into the vast Montana sky, what remains is not just the story of a cowboy, a woman, and a child. It is something far deeper. It is the story of what it means to be human when everything else has been stripped away. Silas Dunn was a man who believed his voice had only brought death. So he buried it. Hannah Whitmore was a woman who had seen the world in many languages, yet still searched for truth. And Caleb, a child broken by loss, carried a courage far greater than his years. Together, they did not just survive the wilderness, they rebuilt something sacred within it. Trust, belonging, and the quiet power of staying. This story teaches us that redemption is not found in grand speeches or empty apologies. It is built slowly, painfully, through action. Silas could not undo the past, but he chose to face it. He chose to protect instead of withdraw, to speak when it mattered, and to stand against injustice even when it meant risking everything. And that is the truth we often forget. Our past may shape us, but it does not have to define the end of our story. It also reminds us that love is not always loud. It is not always poetry or promises whispered under soft light. Sometimes love is a man carrying a broken rifle because it meant something to a child. Sometimes it is a woman standing firm in the face of power, refusing to be bought. Sometimes it is simply staying, through fear, through hardship, through the long, silent nights when words are not enough. Real love is not performed. It is proven. And perhaps most importantly, this story speaks about courage. Not the kind that charges into battle without fear, but the kind that grows quietly within it. Fear is not weakness. It is the ground where courage takes root. Silas was afraid. Hannah was afraid. Even Caleb, with trembling hands, was afraid. But they chose to stand anyway. And in that choice, they changed not only their own lives, but the truth of an entire land that had been buried in silence. So when you walk away from this story, remember this. You do not have to be perfect to make a difference. You do not have to erase your past to build a future. Sometimes all it takes is the decision to stay, to care, and to act when it matters most. Because in the end, the world is not changed by those who speak the loudest, but by those who refuse to turn away when it counts. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.